Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to wherever you are, and welcome to our webinar, Trade Meets AI, Navigating in a Digital New World. My name is Nicholas Kühler-Suzuki. I'm a co-founder of the Trade Policy Exchange. The Trade Policy Exchange is a non-partisan and non-profit platform we launched in 2019 to share ideas and connect trade professionals with the goal to promote an open debate on trade policy between international institutions, governments, civil society, business, and academia. We organize occasional events and informal gatherings for the trade policy community, and I'm happy to announce that our next webinar will be on the African Continental Free Trade Area's digital trade policy, trade protocol. We don't yet have a date for that, but please make sure to subscribe to our social media to receive news and updates from us. As always, we will make a recording of this webinar available on our YouTube channel. But without much further ado, let's get started with this webinar on the nexus between AI and international trade. And for that, I'm excited to welcome Professor Mira Burri from the University of Lucerne in Switzerland. Mira is a leading scholar of digital trade, and I'm delighted she agreed to moderate our panel today. So over to you, Mira.
A warm welcome also from my side to this webinar on Trade Meets AI. Thanks so much for the introduction, Nicholas. I feel privileged to moderate this discussion today. As you know quite well, AI is a set of disruptive technologies that holds the promise of transforming multiple facets of societal life. The interface, however, between AI and trade/trade regulation is rarely in the news if you think of it, and there are still many open questions in this context. And with us today, we have really a group of excellent, renowned experts, both on technology and trade, that will help us address many of these open questions and hopefully even answer some of those questions. As you may have seen from the webinar's program, I will just very briefly introduce the speakers that we have with us today in alphabetical order. So we have Jason Grant-Allen from the Singapore Management University, who is director of the Center for AI and Data Governance. Then we have Greg Atkinson, who is a trade development specialist and expert from the International Trade Center. Johannes Fritz, he's a CEO of the Global Trade Alert, Digital Policy Alert of the St. Gallen Endowment for Prosperity Through Trade. And then my colleague, Kolofelo Kugler, who is on my team at the University of Lucerne, but also is a counsel of the Advisory Center on WTO law. And then last but not least, we have Maria Maciel. She's head of digital commerce and internet policy with the Diplo Foundation. Unfortunately, Martina Ferracani could not join us today, but this gives us more time then to discuss this amongst these excellent speakers that we have today. So I will start really with a sort of a couple of basic questions around the nature of artificial intelligence as a technology. So the question would be, what is artificial intelligence, and how really can this technologies be framed in the discourse of, in particular, AI and trade? I will turn first to Jason with this question, and then go to other experts that we have with us today. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Mira. And I would just echo the comments that you made also. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you to Trade Policy Exchange for hosting this fantastic webinar, which I've been looking forward to a lot. So that's a great question. I must say I'm not envious of myself being the first to answer it. But I think it's a good question. What is AI? But even better, the second part of the question, how do we frame the technology? Because, I think you'll get a somewhat controversial answer from me. the caveat, I'm not a data scientist. I'm not a technological expert. I'm a lawyer. So take it all with a pinch of salt. And, you know, I direct a center called the Center for AI and Data Governance. So, you know, maybe I'm undoing myself here. But I think, you know, we all have in mind loosely what we mean when we say AI, and there is some heuristic value to the term, but I think sometimes it's not necessarily helpful in terms of actually identifying what the salient issues are. So, and I think Craig or some of the other speakers, you know, may talk about the different types of AI system that exist and so forth, and especially in the last year with the explosion of generative AI, we're all aware that different AI systems not only work in different ways, but they do different things, and will therefore be relevant to questions like, you know, international trade in different ways. But I think it's useful in terms of framing to stop and think, well, look, are we trying to look for an abstract definitional sort of or conceptual definition here? Or are we trying to identify kind of a set of technological systems or artifacts that we're concerned with? You know, and if the latter, what are they? How are they being used? How might they be used? And why are we identifying them? Is it for regulatory purposes or is it for other purposes? You know, where are the issues arising or the questions arising? Is it with the way that they use data, for example, and the way that that occurs in a cross-border way? Or is it with automation, for example, in a regulatory or legal perspective? Automation might be desirable or problematic. You know, so I think historically, and I thought about this quite a lot this morning, you know, we go back to like the Dartmouth conference in the 50s when the term is coined, and we see the idea that, you know, every aspect of learning or intelligence, and we're using metaphors to biological, you know, natural intelligence here, can be precisely described so that we can encode a machine to do it. You know, first, this raises a set of problems. Well, you know, what's intelligence? Do we really know that whatever is happening in the machine isn't like our intelligence and so forth? You know, we're then having very interesting and per se important conversations, but they're not always relevant to the practical issue at hand. The second issue is that then we have this shift towards, you know, machine learning based approaches, which don't adopt that approach at all. And here the problem is much rather that, you know, we have a model and it's trained on a bunch of data and then it knows how to do stuff, even though we don't understand why or how or why. And so I suppose artificial intelligence is a term which is used to refer actually to very different technological artifacts and different processes. And then the third problem that I see in terms of choosing our framing correctly is, you know, this AI effect where, oh, it's AI, and then it becomes familiar, and then it's just software, and the AI frontier sort of moves. I think that's maybe less of an artifact of our current time than it was of times in the AI winter, when people were avoiding calling things AI. Now we're calling everything AI and saying that AI is everywhere. But you know, so now I'll get to the question: how do I frame AI or the concept of AI, in particularly in the context of things like trade? I think I generally think in terms of workflows and tools for task automation, and whether that task is decision or prediction or generation of some sort of apparently creative output. I guess I frame it in terms of, well, what is the tool and how is it being incorporated into the relevant sort of workflow of tasks. And sort of final, you know, sort of point, I think one of the concepts I've been exploring recently in terms of framing AI is also this concept of human-based computing, where, you know, we see AI as a set of technological artifacts that are actually coordinating and harvesting human intelligence rather than displaying any innate intelligence themselves. You know, and we're all familiar with that from the CAPTCHA challenges that we have to complete every time we forget a password, where, you know, the the model that's eventually being trained on that is actually only intelligent because there's been sort of an assembly of technological components and human components that have led to the training of the model by humans. So I'll just leave that there. But framing, I think of it in terms of workflows and tools, workflows of very different kinds, and with an implicit relation, especially in the context of machine learning and so forth with data.
Thank you so much, Jason, for this very nuanced framing. I quite like this, the AI winter. I hope it will be springtime soon, and the same will be true also for AI. I do give the word now to Craig, who basically can take up the same question and maybe give us a little bit more sort of details on how you understand artificial intelligence.
Yeah, thank you, Mira. And it's an absolute pleasure to follow Jason on this one, because I feel as though this platform gives us a bit of an outlet to speak about the things that we talk about in private, in other spheres, and now we get to kind of broadcast it online. So I did want to say a few thank yous up front as well. So firstly, to the Trade Policy Exchange. Secondly, to Mira for moderating today. Thirdly, to the fellow esteemed panelists, and also to Nicholas for convening and doing really great coordination on some cool graphic design work that we've seen in all the promotional material, as well as in the background for the Zoom call today. So yeah, this is a really big question. It's kind of one of those ones that Jason hinted on the point where we want to shy away a little bit from the first part of the question. It's really a two-parter, which is, what is AI? This gets really into the weeds a little bit. And then the second part, how can the technology be framed? That gets a little bit personal. That's, where different people have different ways of viewing the technology or set of technologies, however they want to be framed by those people. But I think it is kind of important to kind of step back and look at that first question and say, really, what has AI been understood as? So when I was drafting the concept note for today's event, I really went back to, what was going on in the post-war era and the work of John McCarthy and contemporaries. And I came across the 1955 definition for the Dartmouth Conference that AI, artificial intelligence, is the science and engineering of making intelligent machines. This is a very seminal and really first defining definition of the field of AI, but unfortunately, it's not really that useful for us because it's full of a few loaded words. I mean, intelligent machines, that really opens us to thinking about, what is the word intelligence? What does that mean? So I wanted to kind of unpack both words, artificial intelligence, a little bit and kind of explore those before I get into the framing of AI. So if we really start with the meaning of artificial, I think this is a word that a lot of people tend to have some grasp on, or it's a little bit less debated. The way I think about it is really the implication of synthetic, which seems very appropriate from the perspective of defining AI in various ways that it's defined. So for example, if something is synthetic, it's really an abstraction or a representation about a more complex world or reality. And in many ways, data being the thing that sort of powers artificial intelligence is really that good parallel or analog to the idea of synthetic. So this is really the point that AI is inherently either data enabled in the case of what we call deterministic, classical, or symbolic AI, which Jason touched upon, or data driven in the case of the non-deterministic or the probabilistic or stochastic techniques like machine learning. And artificial can also imply non-natural, which is a very interesting way that Some people tend to think about technology, although I don't really want to go down that path too far because there's a whole debate and philosophical discussion around what is natural and discussions around how to frame technology as an output of humans and how it exists in the world. So I think we can kind of put aside different ways of looking at the word artificial and move towards the word intelligent or intelligence. And Stanford professor Christopher Manning provides kind of an interesting definition that intelligence can be described as the ability to learn and perform suitable techniques to solve problems and achieve goals appropriate to the context of an uncertain, ever-varying world. He also goes on to say that a fully pre-programmed factory robot is flexible, accurate, and consistent, but not intelligent. For the second part, I have to kind of push back on this assertion. In my opinion, what we really knew as the sort of the classical AI is actually kind of defined by what that pre-programmed factory robot is all about. So it's about fundamentally knowledge representation and constructing ontologies about what things are and their relationship, and also programming logic. So if we were to talk about the intelligence word in artificial intelligence, the way that that factory robot is described is actually what classical AI was known to be, or symbolic AI. And it kind of sounds to me, especially with a lot of the things that we're seeing around LLMs and generative AI right now, that that factory robot, given certain known inputs, would yield expected results. And I think that's really important when we try to connect these concepts to international trade, because as we've seen, and we'll probably get into a little bit more later, the issue of hallucinations and the fact that 1 + 1 might not equal 2 in the case of an LLM or other types of machine learning or learning-based stochastic approaches is a little bit problematic. So stepping away from defining artificial intelligence and getting into the framing, I included 3 framings in the concept note. The first was around technical. So I've kind of touched on that. I don't want to get too in depth on all the different ways that AI can be discussed. Most of these lead to a bifurcation in some way that somewhat walks the line of deterministic and non-deterministic. Secondly, legal is a way to frame or define artificial intelligence. Various jurisdictions, various sources of law give definitions to AI that may not have any grounding in what we would consider to be a technical definition, or maybe it's a technical definition within a particular technical community. And Kolo and Johannes are going to speak a lot to that later in the webinar. And thirdly, I'd mentioned industrial as a way to frame AI, thinking about AI as a sector with economic impact and also something that's traded, or an economy around the production of AI and AI techniques. And I wanted to add 2 more framings to this that kind of grounded it a little bit more of a trade perspective in some ways. So one of those is an ethical frame. So in sort of a previous life as a scholar, I was immersed in the field of appropriate technology scholarship. And if you can read any one book this year that maybe comes from a different area but relates specifically to framing AI technologies, I would read Ernst Schumacher's classic Small is Beautiful, which really takes a look at the appropriateness of technology, especially as we've moved from what we would consider to be more indigenous type technologies towards industrialization. And I guess now we're in this 4th or 5th, I don't know what industrial revolution we're on at the moment, but we've kind of taken that path. And there's a need to kind of look at the ethics of technology as it evolves. And then a final framing that I think is interesting here is to talk about the environmental framing of AI, which is something that I don't see discussed very much, but it's actually quite scary to me, because along the lines of the last hype cycle and distributed ledger technologies, or blockchain, as many know, we are using compute and using processing capability, which is all based upon electricity at levels that we've never seen before. And I have to kind of step away from that and think, to what end? Is it so that people can write an email to colleagues and not take the time to write it themselves? Is it that we're going to have a single window system for trade that's processing and determining what various inputs relate to various outputs? So we have to kind of think about the environmental frame and how we are framing AI and its use within the broader kind of definitions and ways to look at the technology, especially in the context of trade. And I'll kind of leave it there, but I think what's really important about the relationship between trade and AI and defining it is that they're both very multifaceted in nature. And I think it's important to understand that there isn't really one size fits all definition. There's many ways to define AI, and there's many different framings of AI. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Greg, for this very rich remarks. I must admit, as a lawyer, very often we just want to have, the precise definition in the law, and without necessarily understanding how the technology works, without really caring, and we miss a lot of these facets that you mentioned. I'm going to hand over to Johannes now for sort of his definition and framing of AI. Johannes?
Yeah, well, hello. I'm Johannes. Thank you so much for having me, Greg, Mira, Nicholas, for putting me up on this panel. I'm Johannes from the St. Gallen Endowment, and we run 2 transparency initiatives that cover digital policy, trade policy, and investment policy. So we are across the entire value chain of AI. We are tracking. It's called the Global Trade Alert and the Digital Policy Alert, as Mira mentioned. And so when I'll rightly pick off what I'll contribute here is 3 framings that I think are useful and that rightly tip off where Craig ended. So this multifaceted problem. When you, Craig, first sent around the outline for this talk, is like exactly right. The first question has to be about framing, because we had to prepare a briefing once in September last year about trade and AI for WTO delegates in Geneva on the sidelines of the public forum. And Tommaso, my colleague, and I, we were just, oh my God, is this the consumer? Is it the knowledge worker? Is it the manager of the knowledge worker? Is it the teacher, the father? This technology is everywhere. What do we do? And so what we ended up with is 3 framings that I think are useful. One from the personal level, as you all also had your personal remarks here. I think me as a user, I think we are all supervisors now in some way. Like AI is unlimited interns. Never trust the intern, obviously, right? Learn to instruct it, learn to check it, and never confuse competence with comprehension, right? So it looks impressive what the intern has done, but are you sure it understood what it was doing? And that's, I think, crucial part as a user, avoid premature delegation, right? So I think this is the risk as a user. If you think about how to frame AI, I think we are all supervisors now, we are all editors now, we are all programmers now in some way or another. But it's to make sure that we don't delegate too much, because else we turn around like, okay, what's 13 times 7? And it's like, okay, and so we'll just turn into bigger problems of delegating a mental load somewhere, and then that wouldn't do us any good. But that's not trade related. That's me, the user, the father, the teacher, the whatnot. And so as then I think what's more relevant to this context is either the framing as me as a domestic regulator or me as the trade guy. So I think for the domestic regulator, the OECD has put out really useful work to just think about this monster that is everywhere, which is the OECD life cycle. You've probably seen it, right? They think about the AI as like there's a design, data, and modeling stage. That's, we don't see it as the users, but it's going on somewhere deep down in Silicon Valley or elsewhere in Paris, probably. And in there, then is the second stage where they verify and validate before they go to the third, which is deployment, and then, operation and use. And so I think for domestic regulators, if you are fortunate enough to draw the UI Act or some similar regulation, I think having this in mind to think through, okay, do I have all bases covered, is a useful rubric, useful framing. So from building the thing, validating the thing, deploying it, and then using it, you can think about it. What do they have to worry about? What risks are they associated with? What obligations do we create? Where do we attach them in the value chain? So that's very useful. But for the trade guy, that's not so useful because, as you know, the trade people and the domestic regulators have a love affair, and they're not even in the same room very often. And that's for digital, that's a huge problem. That they're not, sometimes the New Zealanders said they're not even in the room next door. So they're just like, they're somewhere, those regulators. But there is enough for the trade people to think about. And the framing I like, the one we came up with then in September for this presentation was, let's think about AI along a value chain. And so if you think an AI value chain, there I think we have 4 components, or you can add a 5th. So that I would start with AI hardware. And that's also where I make room for the 5th. So AI hardware, obviously, we think of chips, we think of compute. But as Craig, like I said, we think of energy as a major input needed by all those things. So you have the first component, AI hardware plus energy. And there's lots of trade issues we could throw on that. Export restrictions, you know it, we'll come to that. AI models, so the foundational models, right? This is OpenAI's GPT. That's part of the value chain, the foundational models. And there could be trade issues hiding in there that involve copyright stuff, IP protection, you know, get to that as well. Hardware, model, and then comes AI-enabled applications. So that would be your ChatGPT, if you wish, just you interacting directly with that. There we go into all kinds of issues that are trade relevant in some way. It's copyright, yes, but there we go also into already putting a toe maybe into services, something like that, right? Data flows, definitely. Where are we going here? And definitely we are in there in any AI-enabled product or service. So, you know, if we develop our own tools that use somebody else's models and somebody else's stuff, if we have cars that have sensors that do stuff and drive us around, anything you would like in the Internet of Things. So if you think about those 4 elements, from hardware to model to the AI-enabled applications to the AI-enabled products and services, as trade people, we can think about those dimensions, I think, pretty well. And so that's what I think is most useful for me when I think about the trade context here. But this is really like a pure trade context. So AI as a trade thing. I very much like your framing, Jason, where you say, you know, trade enabling AI. So using AI to speed things up, to optimize supply chains. That's another total facet. This is about trade facilitation, trade support, electronic trade. I think this is fantastic. And this is also a can of worms that I would love to open with you guys. But that's the framing for me. The user framing, the domestic regulators framing along life cycle, and the trade framing along the AI value chain. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Johannes, for highlighting also these different perspectives. And I quite agree with you that there is this disconnect that we have between the different decision makers along the value chain, which is, I think, also a very helpful framing. So thank you so much. And I'm going to give the floor now to Maria for sharing her views on how AI should be framed. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mira, and thanks to the Trade Policy and Exchange for the invitation to be here, and to Craig and Nicholas for framing this discussion, and starting with this question, which I'm finding quite fascinating to sit here and listen to everybody and see how each of us came from different perspectives to offer a definition or framing of AI. And it's very hard to speak first, like Jason, but it's very hard to speak last and to say something different, but I'm gonna try. I think that enabling machines to perform activities that have been associated somehow with human intelligence have really served as an utopian ideal that has helped mankind to move forward in terms of technology development. If we see in history as early as 1769, so we're talking about the 18th century, Charles Bonnet, which is a philosopher from Geneva, wrote that machines could be made one day to imitate human intelligence. And of course, at that time, that was complete fiction. But this fiction and this vision has inspired amazing breakthroughs in terms of computation and throughout history. And we can see traces of that in the works of Babbage or Ada Lovelace or Alan Turing. So the fact that this idea has been so constantly in the back of our minds, I think, helps to explain why the AI winters that we had, the periods of low interest or low investment or low progress, are always followed by new waves of AI summers or AI hype. But what makes this present AI hype perhaps so interesting is that maybe for the first time, due to massive digitization and advances in processing power, we have the conditions finally to make this vision flourish, even if we are in the early days of AI, but now it's the time to develop finally here. So as we can see from everyone speaking, I think that there is no one definition of AI, and we were confronted with this problem when we decided to offer our first training, our first capacity building on AI, which was 5 years ago. So AI was not this expanded and topic in the spotlight as it is today, but we were confronted not only with a lack of definition, but also with a huge anthropomorphization, which is a very difficult as well and complicates a lot this debate. So what we decided to do as Diplo Foundation was to talk about this technology we need to understanding. So we decided to go and look under the bonnet. So some years ago, we created our small division inside Diplo called the AI Lab, which is where the engineers and the data analysts work. Is the coolest division, not the policy side where I am, but where they work is a total fun. And we managed over the years to integrate AI in our pedagogy. We trained our own language models, for instance, with the body of knowledge and the transcripts that have been produced over the years in internet governance and digital policy meetings. And it's a huge body of knowledge. We trained our language models, and when we offer internet governance courses, we give our students the opportunity to design their own a document on a digital AI compact, which is a very important document that we are discussing now in the context of the UN Summit of the Future. And they do that by interacting with an AI, a chatbot that we developed based on this body of knowledge and prompting this AI. So I think that one of the things that connects to the trade discussion that we're having here is that using AI as an infrastructure or AI as a service of or open and source solutions that we have available, there's a lot to do even as small organizations in-house to develop customized applications that will serve us internally or that will serve our clients and our communities. So AI today is not something that is very out of reach that only large companies can use and develop. But over the years, while we did this effort of including in AI in our pedagogy and looking under the bonnet, I think that we arrived at not some definitions, but some conclusions that perhaps can help with the framing too. The first of them is that AI is really a moving target, as Jason mentioned, in the sense that the technology that has become commonplace and is everywhere is often not described as AI anymore. The term is really used to apply to the cutting edge technology. However, it's very important to continue to be aware of the various ways in which AI is already impacting our lives, from facial recognition in our phones or algorithms that offer us films or music. And in fact, I think that these everyday occurrences that today seem so ordinary to us are very important and very crucial for policymakers and decision makers. Sometimes we get lost sometimes in the debate about artificial general intelligence and existential threats, when there are issues that are very close to us. The second point that we mentioned is that AI is a general purpose technology, and we discussed that with our students. So it brings change from different environments, from the household to companies. And I think that impact that it will have in the future can be compared to internal combustion or electricity, the internet before. So I think it's very fair to call it one of the pillars of what we are calling the fourth industrial revolution. And the final and last conclusion that we arrived looking at AI from Diplo's perspective is that if you look closely, no matter how groundbreaking the technology looks like, AI really works if you break it apart in a very simple way and based in two very basic principles of human cognition, which are the identification of patterns and the estimation of probability. So AI functions by discovering patterns. We offer data to AI. AI studies this data using algorithms that have been offered to it, and it discovers patterns that help it to perform tasks that are useful to us, such as making film recommendations or recommendations on Amazon. And the second is probability. So when we ask AI, imagine that we have a new African country that emerged and it's independent now. And if we ask AI, how would the flag of a new country in Africa look like? It will look into all flags of existing African countries. And based on this analysis, it will identify that there are some preferred colors, usually like red and green, yellow, and some patterns as well, like stripes or stars. And then it will come up with a suggestion of what a new flag would look like. But probability is not certainty. And if you look at the African continent, for instance, there are some outliers. If you look at the flag of Somalia, it's blue and there's a star, no stripes. So I think that there are two consequences that are important to retain here. One is that if you want to think outside the box, don't ask AI. Or learn how to prompt AI correctly. And we need to protect human outliers in this discussion. It's important to have a space for the outliers from a philosophical and practical perspective. And the outliers, I think they also demystify the myth that AI is so infallible. So in the area of regulation, this is very important and it's very clear. The outliers show where the risks lie, where are the moments in which AI, based on patterns and probability, gave us wrong answers, and these wrong answers may have really concrete impacts on human lives. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Marilia. And also letting us know about this fascinating project that you have at Diplo Foundation. That was very interesting, and I quite like the link that you made to general purpose technologies. I think it's quite a helpful thing because they have this spillover effects and they normally develop in a non-linear way, which makes it very hard to regulate, right? So, and with this, I don't think we provided a very clear answer to the first question, but certainly we offered a great number of very useful tools for the audience, for different people in the audience to understand this very complex technology. And I would like now to move to the second question of our panel, making already the link a little bit to trade and asking you what are the opportunities as well as the risks of artificial intelligence in international trade. And I will start here with Greg.
Thank you, Mira. So yes, what are the opportunities and risks of AI in international trade? I think this is another one of these big and fundamental questions. And I was thinking a lot over these past weeks about how to really answer this question without getting lost in too many particular, let's call them use cases for AI technologies. I think there's a really manageable way to address this question. That's to break it down into smaller pieces. And one of those is to look at different levels of where the technology presents opportunities and also creates risks or creates threats. So I'm going to do that structured sort of around a micro, meso, macro framework. So starting at the micro level, this is really what I would call the firm level or the business level. And this is where we see a lot of the discussion around AI for business. And this really relates in many cases to that task level and business operations. But it can even be related to diverse areas such as in creative or production processes. I think we've seen a lot of the discussion in this particular area focus on generative AI, Gen AI, recently. There's a creative industry that's come out on its own just related to the production of visuals using generative AI techniques. I have to say that the graphics for this webinar were actually produced by humans. So Nicholas confirmed that earlier in this discussion. So we are taking a human approach today, but we are really kind of looking at what are those opportunities, and Gen AI has to be, especially for businesses of any size, it has to be one of those key opportunities at that micro business level. So moving on from that micro level, I think the meso level is really where we start to see the business, or even the consumer for that matter, start to interact with the market. and thinking about the market level, specifically in this conversation, thinking about international markets. And I think there's a lot of opportunities there for the ability of businesses to engage in cross-border compliance and have a better sense of market information and supply chain visibility than ever before. There's new ways of understanding and even translating various documents and materials that would relate to market opportunities that were not previously possible or not quite feasible for businesses of various sizes. So this meso level is really how a firm kind of gets outside of itself and gets closer to the market. And it also kind of allows for the identification of where connecting into higher priority value chains can occur. I think this is a really interesting kind of pathway as we chart these opportunities from the firm itself to groups of firms and industries, looking at where they can access opportunities internationally based upon not only the opportunities that relate to the policy environment, for example, but also just to where those customers are and where they're able to see opportunities and gain margins. So kind of following along this as well, there's some opportunities that relate to the meso level that really reflect this idea of digital transformation and the different phases of digital transformation being digitization, digitalization, and then the endpoint of digital transformation, looping around. A really interesting one is optical character recognition. So trade takes place right now. It's still in a very paper-dominated world, but through narrow AI techniques, we have the ability to take all of these pieces of paper and rapidly transform them into electronic forms so they become more useful, not only just for traditional approaches like sending electronic copies of documents, but also for extracting the data elements that exist in those documents. So this really starts to bridge from the micro to the meso more into that getting closer to a macro level, kind of following along this pathway. And another interesting, maybe the most hyped opportunity in trade that kind of follows along this pathway is relating to goods trade. And this idea that we can potentially automate aspects of goods trade like customs classification. This has been one that has been espoused to be the sort of great equalizer for the small business that can't figure out how to classify its goods for the purposes of export declarations, et cetera. I'm a little bit skeptical about this particular application or opportunity. I think it's an area where even humans have difficulty on one side at the level of a business. And then on the other side, you have governments that are constantly changing and altering the classification of various goods. And so it creates this sort of discrepancy that I don't really think most AI approaches are appropriate for, but a lot of the solutions providers think otherwise. So going up to this macro level, then I think there's a lot in there that's close to my heart, and I know close to many people on this panel's way of thinking, especially the lawyers that we have here, is really thinking about how do we look at AI and that macro level economic and governance strategy and planning. I think there is potential here to look at new ways of not just what we've done with econometrics in the past, but looking at new ways to achieve efficiencies that bring a country's potential closer to what trade theory would say, but where maybe the trade policy or trade law, public trade law side falls a little bit short. And this can kind of intervene in very practical ways. So we can really look at the opportunities around AI-assisted negotiations. Those can relate to human aspects, like when we need to come to consensus on an issue and really need to maybe work with fact-driven or insight-driven ways of negotiating. And there's also potential, and this has been a big discussion as of late, related to how we actually approach the idea of legal drafting and expressing these various clauses that create obligations and prohibition among, in this context of public law, various country actors. I don't really want to get into this too deeply because we've already done a webinar on computational law, and this kind of treads into that space a little bit. But I also think it is very helpful to understand that when we look at all these systems that have been used to enable trade, particularly the what's known as the National Single Window under the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, Article 10.4, various AI approaches are bringing new abilities and capabilities to look at dense legal texts and move them from these natural language sources into forms that can be readily used by the so-called rules engines that power these systems. And on the other side of this, you have the variety of different e-commerce platforms that require similar sources of computationally expressed rules for the purposes of the compliance side. So yeah, these are some of the more on the opportunity side, looking at the micro, meso, macro framing of AI in international trade. But there's also, risks at each of these levels. And I will leave a little bit more for others to speak about risks, but I'll name a few that I think I've identified that are quite relevant. So especially due to the systemic nature of some AI techniques and approaches. So fundamentally, I think the biggest risk of AI is ignoring AI. We can't just say, AI is not going to have some kind of impact on the way the world works. We're already seeing, and the way that trade occurs, we're already seeing things that are making us realize that AI is becoming pervasive. But I think as it does become pervasive, and we cannot ignore this fact, I think another issue relates to this idea of the digital divide. So the idea of digital divide has historically been around access to internet and computer technology, device technologies, et cetera. But now we're kind of seeing that as AI proliferates, access to this technology is becoming a new form of division. And in fact, we don't know, and this might be a bit out there to say, but at some point in the future, could AI become a prerequisite for participation in trade, particularly for maybe not a large multinational corporation, but maybe for a smaller business or a medium-sized business that doesn't necessarily have the human capacity to participate, and that AI piece, that AI access becomes the divide between participation locally or international markets. And then there's another piece here that's a real big risk, in my opinion. It relates to the idea of vendor lock-in. So this kind of has two pieces to it, in my opinion. And I think some of the others will speak to this, so I don't want to go too far into this and step on anyone's toes, but there's this issue that we're seeing geopolitically right now, that there's very few producers of the hardware that we need for AI. So that creates a serious issue when we become dependent on a technology that's underlied by specific sets of hardware. And then another issue is this idea of vendor lock-in from the software side. So, these risks are multifaceted and they're interconnected, but I think we can say that for every opportunity that there is at the micro, meso, and macro level for AI in international trade, there seems to be an equal and opposite risk. And so I think this is quite a good summary of these opportunities and risks for AI in international trade.
Thank you so much, Craig. I really like this sort of layering of AI trade interface. I think that's very, very helpful. I am going to try today to ask AI to apply the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. I wonder whether that's going to work on the schedules. But yeah, thank you so much. And I'm going to hand over now to Johannes for sort of his view on how what are the risks and opportunities of AI in the domain of international trade.
Yeah, so let me again connect right to Craig, and I'll bring 3 opportunities and 3 risks. I will attach them again on my value chain in some places, so because that's how we thought about it back then. But I very much agree also with what Craig was saying about the trade enabling opportunities on the macro level. I think that's very well put. And we connect probably on what you said about the macro risk, because that's when I come back about one of my challenges that I see is also going to be very much what you said last. So let me hold that for a minute and just get to the opportunities first. So on the 3 opportunities, I think, again, I'm thinking about how could this shift trade as such, trade in AI services, trade in related products, or the hardware side, if you think about my value chain. And the obvious one is that we're talking about, okay, if we think what you mentioned also, Craig, AI as a service, if you are the creator of the foundational model, it looks like there the trade balance is heavily in America's favor, as always. So these are the big companies are over there who can build these models. There are a few in Europe. I'm sure in Asia there are some emerging. But it looks like in that side of things, trade goes more or less one way. Whether it creates a dependence, I'm a bit more benign because we see a lot of flurry in these activities, but we can probably agree that the cutting edge is very concentrated. But what I think is more interesting from a trade perspective, we're thinking about how will trade develop, and the opportunities in trade develop is related or deferred services and hardware that come from these big models. So thinking about who could benefit from this huge amount of compute that we need to run into, and leave chips away for a side because chips is well discussed. But I think from compute, what's interesting is there is an opportunity here for, energy-rich countries. So like Morocco with a lot of sun, Spain, the Nordics with a lot of water, the Koreans, South Korea, with developing new nuclear techniques that are easier and quicker to deploy. If energy is kind of the resource that runs the thing, that I could see a trade develop, that the AI service is built in the United States, but the manufacturing of it is outsourced abroad, creating opportunities for countries who are well set up, have the infrastructure, because we all have seen American infrastructure getting a lot better, I know, but they're not the fastest at moving distance. They have a lot of oil right now and have a lot of energy, but systemically, I think there is opportunity for other countries to step in and create themselves as one of those manufacturing hubs of AI, if you wish. So that's an opportunity right there. And the other opportunity that I'm also very excited about, and we see green shoots of, is at helping. There's 2 facets. One is if you have an infrastructure that's very permissible to facilitating the validation of AI created products and services. So what I'm thinking about is that AI is going to be hugely deployed in pharmaceuticals. We have seen that already, right? We all know how the gene folding worked and saved us from the virus. So there's a lot of that going on, and that's great. And then what could attract more of this kind of work, this high-powered pharmaceutical development work, are jurisdictions where there is a strong but a more flexible permission structure. I'm not saying we should just deploy all AI engineered pharmaceuticals all over the planet, but if you are a country where there is a fast response of an FDA, of whoever is in charge of, going through the trials, understanding the trials, making sure they're accurate, but you have a system that's permissive to this kind of thing, that actually the regulatory process can keep up with the pace of development. I think there's an opportunity there for countries to attract, investment in these very high value jobs and works right there, that probably there is some gaps that Europe and the United States leave open for others to jump in and develop these kind of regulatory environments where the application of AI systems can thrive. And so you build an industry that just helps people use this technology and bring it to market with its results. So that's one aspect of it. That's more about the investment side. But then about the service trade side, I think we see it already, I'm sure I heard already, the entire idea that if you have a structure that is able to validate the quality of an AI-enabled services, say in telemedicine or in education, that you can, award this. I'm looking at Singapore here because I have some, but this is definitely Singapore's job, where we see, for instance, in the UK, people calling that, can't we deploy Singaporean telemedicine in the UK and help us with the National Health Service conundrum that we have over here? So, there's an entire new stream of trade we could unlock by allowing validated services that are rapidly deployed in one environment, such as Singapore, to be able, to connect it to European markets, to other markets around the globe. This could happen in medicine, obviously dicey, it could happen in education, it could happen anywhere. And so I think going away from looking at what is the opportunities on the development of the model as such, which is interesting, but we have seen that, thinking about what opportunities are there in being the manufacturer, being the one who helps you bring stuff to market that you invent, or helping you bring out services in a validated manner, I think could shift the trade landscape a bit more than just thinking about, oh, it's going to be the Americans, oh, it's going to be the research-rich Europeans, or whatever. So I think there are opportunities abound for the Asian countries, for the African countries, if they tap into it. We see it in Kenya, we see it in Nigeria. So fantastic stuff. This is the opportunities there for, I think, trade in AI things. Two concerns. I mean, when we thought about it along the value chain, what we came back with to the Geneva delegates was that we said, well, actually, you all know this. There are some special things about AI and its regulation and deployment, which I'm sure we'll get to later. It's about AI risk tiering principles, all that stuff. But much of the stuff is already known, and AI just adds more oomph, more power to the question. So what I'm talking about is starting off with what you said, Craig, about worrying about being dependent of hardware, right? If you think of AI as a strategic asset with all the chains, so you need to compute, you need the services, everything. That turns the thing obviously into the objective for industrial policy, and we see that right now. Right, I'm for an endowment that's called itself prosperity through trade. So when I see U.S. Secretary of the Treasury going to the Chinese and complaining that they should drill down their subsidies so their own subsidies works, something in me dies. But that's the way today. But I think we are in for much more of that, because we begin to take data as an asset, right? AI is like a fracking moment. We now have much better access to corporate data than we ever had before. People figuring this out. This is a competitive thing. China calls data already the fourth factor of production. So let's get into the subsidy race over there, right? So it's going to be very juicy. But these are all known trade concerns. I know that part. So that's the first risk I see over there. But again, it's old stuff in new clothes. And you see that elsewhere. So if you think of a second one, I think is thinking about import tariffs, right? There is an opportunity and a risk somewhere if you want to build out, say, the ITA, the Information Technology Agreement, do we enlarge it? Do we to include more of this stuff to really make the AI hardware flow around the world freely? That's something we could think about. But what it really puts more pressure on is this entire discussion that Mira could tell you probably books and books about, and Colo as much as well, this discussion at the WTO or in trade circles, right? Is it a digital good? Is it a digital service? What is it, right? Where are we here? Because that kind of unlocks the entire cascade of agreements that apply or don't apply, whether you think whatever I'm shipping to you is a digital service or a digital good. And the reason we couldn't decide on this is that the reason we have this third problem in this space, which is what the freak are electronic transmissions, right? We have a moratorium still, and it's not referring to digital goods or services because people couldn't agree. And so they call it electronic transmissions. And so in the AI space, this is just going to get more important. Are we going to allow some sort of taxation to happen at the border for anything related to the data that feeds the systems, the data that comes out of the systems? And so again, a challenge, a trade policy concern that's amplified by the rise of AI. And if the rise is as fast, then I think we have a lot more pressure in the WTO system to solve that once and for all. Third challenge, the obvious one, data governance, right? Cross-border data transfers, data localization, how we manage data protection. already we have initiatives to figure out data free flow with trust, right? We have other ways of how can we certify data protection, and it's just, again, so much more relevant now than it was 3 years ago, even though AI took all the air out of the data discussions in the G7 presidency last year. They tried to do something and nobody paid attention. Underneath it all, it's like the most important question to address going forward. How do we solve the data conundrum? So those are my 3 opportunities and my 3 challenges that I see along my value chain. Go.
Thank you so much, Johannes. I agree on all points with you, and thank you so much already for offering some insights on the sort of the future of AI and sort of this global competition in the domain of AI that we might have, and already making a little bit the link to the law. And of course, regulatory frameworks must address both the risks and the opportunities. You both seem to be a little bit on the AI optimist side, but I turn now over to sort of the regulatory side, to the law, and I would like to ask Kolo and then also Johannes to address the question of what are the emergent sources, so what are the AI-related legal frameworks that we have, and how are they going forward, how are they evolving and developing. Kolo, I turn to you. I believe you have some slides to show. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, specifically to Craig for organizing, and obviously Trade Policy Exchange, which is a platform that I invite all of you to follow. I am going to share some slides. Don't be scared. I did so because there's just so much. I'm not going to obviously speak through everything, but just hit the highlights. And I hope nonetheless you find this interesting. Let me just start my presentation. Okay. All right. Can everybody see my presentation, my slides? Okay, perfect. All right. Thank you so much already for making the link to trade, and I think also for you all who have made these comments about AI being a general purpose technology along the lines of electricity and the internet. It's just one other technology that kind of amplifies different things that are already existing. And I think, people think about AI with much trepidation, but it's just another new thing, in my opinion, in my humble opinion. And, as a disclaimer, I'm not a technologist, I am a lawyer. But it seems that there's no need to fear. Yes, there is need to regulate this technology. It's not new. It is experiencing a lot of hype, especially, with the new technologies that are kind of working alongside it. But I think, especially recently, the initiatives that have been taken are taking us to the correct place where we're trying to regulate, but also, accounting for and encouraging innovation. Before I go into the non-trade initiatives that are happening, and there are many of them, I just want to sort of obviously put in a plug for trade and sort of the the WTO, 1.0, agreements that already exist. And just to say that they would obviously apply to AI-related goods and services, and of course, we'll talk, and also sort of intellectual property, right? These large language models that troll the internet and may use proprietary information, that would be an issue under the TRIPS to the extent that the nationals and of that country are protected under the TRIPS. And so, unfortunately, and as Johan was alluding to, that the WTO has agreements in silos. And so it would be very difficult to kind of think about, legal services, it's a services issue, or maybe even better, an autonomous car. Is it a good? Is it a service? Okay, the car itself is a good. That would be a goods issue. Maybe even, customs classification. Is it a computer? Is it a service? But the issues that obviously are kind of clear, but the issues that are a little bit, need a little bit more nuance. In the second part of my intervention, I will be talking about technical standards, which I think is probably where, the trade, interest really lies. And I think if we're not thinking about it, we should. But already we see WTO law and WTO agreements applying. We have an AB decision in China Audiovisuals that basically says that, you know, some of these commitments that members made in technology 2.0 would apply in technology 4.0. And so, you know, to the extent that a legal bot is providing cross-border legal services and the member has made legal services in mode 3, that would absolutely be a violation if there was some sort of trade restriction. And so just kind of reminding us that although, yes, we don't have a standalone trade-related AI agreement, and we don't even have sort of an international regulator for trade at all, I mean, for AI at all, but to the extent that AI technology and services and products intersect with WTO agreements, and there would be sort of implications and rights and obligations, obviously, under WTO law. So that's all I'm going to say about trade, because as we all know, the party isn't at the WTO, but in other international, and I'm going to specifically speak to the international initiatives, and then Johannes will talk about the national initiatives. So very sort of overview level of what's happening. I'll just sort of mention also while I speak to, you know, this consolidation that we're seeing actually, although a lot of these initiatives are, you know, not more than probably 5 or 6 years old, but we do see, you know, the meeting of minds and thought of how, you know, AI could potentially be regulated. I should also sort of, unless if I, you know, obviously make a specific reference to, you know, the Council of Europe framework, none of these are, as we legally binding. They're sort of principles and soft law, as we call them. And so I guess we have to also think about, you know, the enforceability and such. All right. So, you know, I think the OECD really, and this has been alluded to, really kind of set the stage of you know, thinking about AI principles, and in May 2019 already thinking about these value-based principles. And you will see, you know, a lot of repetition of these. So, you know, I'm not really going to go into the other ones, but really I think we should really sort of focus on the OECD principles because they set the stage for other subsequent bodies and instruments. So, you know, principles like inclusive growth, sustainable development and well-being, human-centered values, you know, human oversight and fairness, transparency, explainability, robustness, security, and safety. So these are sort of the principles, but also alongside the principles, the OECD has made recommendations for policymakers, which really go to recommending, you know, research and development, fostering digital ecosystem that's conducive for AI, enabling policy environments, you know, including regulatory sandboxes, and, you know, sort of trying to cooperate on regulations, human capacity, and preparing labor, because of course AI is going to be disruptive. We've already got a report coming out from the IMF that's, you know, specifically states that higher sort of developed countries will probably face more labor market transformation and disruption than economies that do not use AI, are not AI ready. And then obviously, which is important for us, is international cooperation and for trustworthy AI. Interesting enough, this is just to show that the OECD AI principles sort of diffusion across the world, obviously through the OECD members themselves, which are, you know, these countries in blue, but also through G20 members, you know, including countries like India and South Africa and China and Russia and the likes. And then there are some countries, sort of more in Latin America, that adhere to these OECD principles. So it's, you know, obviously not universal, but there's a lot of adherence to these principles. The G20 AI principles basically mirror and copy paste those. And so this also goes to this diffusion that I showed you in the previous picture. We've also got the UNESCO recommendation on ethics, and I think it's well sort of pointing out that the discussion on regulation of AI right now has to do a lot with the ethics, with transparency, with non-discrimination, and avoiding bias. I will speak later to sort of, you know, the more trade-related, you know, issues. Obviously, data protection would be one of them that sort of Johannes alluded to, but also standards. But just for your knowledge is that it's really thinking about, how do AI systems potentially affect human beings? And this is, sort of the standpoint, the vantage point at which AI is being regulated going forward. And also, sort of, a reflection of, fundamental freedoms and human rights and human dignity, diversity and inclusiveness, these type of things moving forward. And also, there are principles that the UNESCO have specifically recommended: proportionality, do no harm, sustainability, and as I said, right to privacy, data protection, human oversight, responsibility, accountability, awareness and literacy, making sure that people, are digitally literate, and multi-stakeholder adaptive governance and collaboration, which is something that's really sort of, you see across the line that there is a desire to have this multi-stakeholder and international cooperation, collaboration on AI regulation. As Johannes alluded to before, the G7 did also issue, a code of conduct for organizations, and which is interesting. Here that, specifically targeting organizations. It could be, obviously firms, it could be others that develop AI systems, and really sort of looking at, risk mitigation, identifying, incidents and patterns of misuse, vulnerabilities, responsible information sharing and reporting of incidents, security controls, content authentication, effective mitigation measures, also trying to see if AI can solve the world's greatest challenges, including the climate crisis, global health, education, etc. And interestingly, here they bring about something that is of interest, obviously, to the trade communities: international technical standards, and also data input measures and protections for personal data, and also for intellectual property. I'm not going to go sort of deeply, but I just will mention also that the UN has a new AI advisory body, as recent as 2023, and it's also the UN trying to sort of chime in as well. Obviously, it's an international organization, 193 members, and just so you know, the UNESCO recommendation was adopted by all 193 countries, so it has universal acceptance. Which goes even further than the OECD, but also the UN advisory body, and they have members as well that have issued this document in 2023 that also speaks to human rights and making sure that it benefits all, public interest, etc., etc. Just other initiatives, briefly, I'll mention that the ITU has got AI for Good. It issues a report on the UN's activities in artificial intelligence, which is a joint effort between the ITU and the 46 UN agencies and bodies. NATO also has a data artificial intelligence review board. They have 6 principles of responsible use. You could see that, very much, in line with, what has been happening, from the OECD going now. Including, bias mitigation, lawfulness, reliability, etc. And interesting for NATO, they are developing an AI standard, obviously, for weapons since February 2023, and it was supposed to be issued by the end of last year, but it's still in development. So that should be an interesting development. Now I'm just going to quickly hop onto the regional initiatives. What's interesting in the region, and obviously the EU AI Act is an interesting one, but that would be something that Johannes would speak to. But the Council of Europe has a framework convention on artificial intelligence and human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. It has been approved by the Council of Europe in March 2024. Right now, as we speak, it's been transmitted and will be voted on in the spring session, so this week. And it should be formally adopted 17 May 2024. This is very interesting for us because it is a convention, it is binding. Although, as you will see in a few slides, that the dispute settlement provisions are not as strong, but just for the fact that there's an internationally binding treaty on AI is an interesting development. just also showing to you, they have the principles that we've seen across sort of coming on board here as well. And just to show you the dispute settlement provision that basically says that parties can resolve dispute through negotiation or any other peaceful mean of their choice. So it's not litigious, but nonetheless, there is scope to resolve disputes through that framework. Just skipping along to ASEAN, there's a guide that came out in 2024 in February. There's guiding principles from the framework. You could see as well that they are very similar to what we've seen going back to 2019 from OECD and others. And they also have, components, the type of sort of measures and considerations that ASEAN member states should consider when adopting AI policies or AI laws. Skipping through that. And then the African Union does not specifically have as yet a, sort of a guiding principles, but there is a white paper. There was a AI blueprint that was issued in 2021. Right now, there's the white paper, but what's interesting in February 2024 is the Digital Trade Protocol, which I will speak to in the next slides, but it does not mention AI, but it at least talks about emerging and advancing technologies. And there was also a declaration.
Hello, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but maybe just to conclude already, because we are running out of time.
Okay, no problem, no problem.
Thank you.
I'm going to conclude with this and say that there are developments in PTAs. AI is being, added on into DEAs and PTAs. But right now we're seeing cooperative type of not binding commitments. But obviously, as time develops, probably could be an area where things strengthen up. And we're looking forward to seeing further developments. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Golo, for offering this really comprehensive picture of the relevance of the law and the multiple actors that engage in AI governance and the emerging initiatives, all those things that we have. So I'm going to give the word now to Johannes to maybe just very briefly give us sort of his idea of emerging AI-related law and the relevance of the existing rules.
Exactly right. So really to speak, I'm domestic mirror of Colo in a sense. So when it is about what are some emergent sources of AI-related law and how are they evolving, this is what the Digital Policy Alert is all about. And I will just keep it very short, 2 slides, tell you how we think about the issue. I'm going to jump the very first one, essentially just saying there is a lot of things going on. You are aware of that. We track it. So here's a graph made by the nice people of the IMD using our data, essentially showing how AI regulatory activity has been picking up. So the red stuff is binding rules and regulation that are proposed. The yellow stuff is guidance. So what would that be? That is, the data protection agency talking about how privacy law applies to OpenAI's latest things, or copyright law, like Colo mentioned, that, everything applies, right? So lots of guidance for that. We also see enforcement action already. We all remember the Italians going after ChatGPT right away, but it's also Clearview AI, facial recognition, that kind of stuff. Really getting started. And yeah, on the other side, good side, international cooperation. What Colo showed us, right? It's all about figuring out how can we align on AI principles, how can we avoid the data flow patchwork that we find ourselves in. So we built that right from the start and don't have to retrofit. That's good. We need more of it. I'll leave it there for you. I mean, these kind of developments are on our site. If you want to look at it, we have an AI tracker there. There's a policy alert. What I'm going to spend more time on now and jump right over is what we did is ask us that question. Well, the one you put, what can we say about the development of these rules? How do we think about it? I mean, 400 things going around. What do we think about? And we looked in detail at a couple of about 12 what we call comprehensive frameworks. So regulatory approaches, that don't just that add up, thinking around AI either around the value chain or around the life cycle. And we found those in the EU, obviously the AI actors there. In China, we have, if you take them together, somewhat comprehensive regulatory framework that applies to deep synthesis and recommendation algorithms and all these good things, and generative AI. And in the USA, you have, it's not regulation, but you have intentions, right? In Bill of Rights, the executive order, and to some degree in the NIST risk management framework. On top of that, less known, there are other areas where this happens: Argentina, Brazil, Canada, South Korea, Russia. They all have AI framework laws in some way or another in some stage of the life cycle. And so we took those and looked at them provision by provision to really get an idea of what's going on here. And we got completely lost. But we found solace and help in the OECD AI principles that Kola mentioned. I fully agree with her. This is a really nice rubric to think about it. Like, my AI value chain went out the window. What do I use next? I need a new tool. And so we took the OECD AI principles and just mapped all provisions into the thing. So what we did, we have about 70 requirements that we came up with, something like, do you need to do bias testing? Do you need to do human oversight? Do you have rights to information as the person subject to the AI? You're using it, you are a worker, all these kind of good things that we want to have, and many, many more. And so what we did is we tagged these acts I just mentioned and really provision by provision, check out what's going on, and then map those requirements back up to the OECD AI principles. So, bias testing, well, that's something that's probably in the principle number 2, which is about fairness, right? And so thinking these through 70 times, we came up with this mapping between these provisions and the OECD AI principles, and then we can draw graphs like these. So here is a graph that looks at China, Europe, and the United States for all those acts that I mentioned in the earlier slide, and just maps out for every requirement we found. So the EU AI Act has 175 requirements by our count. Taking those 175, where do they fall into the AI principles? And you see there's a lot about accountability in the European Union, right? In the US and China, it's more about safety, right? We have the risk management framework after all in there, right? So, and in fairness, it's the these are the concerns in China about political accuracy and correctness and all that stuff. It's all in there. And we are currently writing a thesis about how can we compare not just these 3 but all the others, and where are the gaps internationally? Like, are we emphasizing all the principles in a systematic way? You see principle 1 isn't there, but inclusive growth is a weird one from the perspective of regulatory AI stuff. And it's about, ensuring the digital transformation goes well. And that's usually nothing that UI cares about very much. So that's fine, I think. But the others, and then we have a balance between the principles. That's the first question we are asking ourselves. And then the other one, okay, looking at the provision by provision level, where are the gaps? Where are the design choices? Do we already have interoperability concerns, right? To avoid this data governance patchwork, can we get this right from the start, or at least think about it consciously? And so that's what we do at the Global Trade Alert, at Digital Policy Alert right now. You can get a sneak peek of what we are doing. If you look at Clerk, Clerk is our tool to conquer digital rules, as we say, very self-esteem high. Essentially, it's similar to what I think the tool I definitely have to check out right after this call, which is the one the Diplo has developed. We are essentially loading these texts that I was just mentioning, plus the UN Convention and all the other stuff, into a high accuracy generative AI. We allow you to read the full text, to compare it with visual tools that do fancy highlighting, to really help us explore. And we use these tools to do our work ourselves. Obviously, it's always human verified. Never trust the intern, right? That's true. Even if it's a very good intern, we think, but still verify it yourself. And we make that available to the public for now. It's in beta. You can see all the 70 different requirements up there and go through the UI Act, navigating and just looking at that. And we do this to really think about, where does this go? Where are the fault lines? And so if I'll leave it there because I could go a bit into the details of what we are seeing, but you can see, for instance, just as a sneak peek, we get into issues like if you do risk assessments, right? Everybody does a risk assessment, but we see difference in, for instance, okay, which systems have to do it? For instance, in Argentina and Brazil, everybody has to risk assess in these draft laws. Why? Because they are self-delegating, they're self-assigning themselves into risk categories. So you're an AI developer, you have an AI, you have to do a risk assessment, and with that outcome, you say, well, I'm high risk, I'm low, I'm this and that. And so everybody has to do it. Very different in the European Union, right? They tell you, you are high risk, you are high risk, you are high risk, and then you have to do all the assessments. So that's one design choice. Another interesting one that really caught my eye is about, well, you assess this risk, right? But you have a tool that's extremely flexible. I can use GPT to make a cookbook recipe or a bomb recipe, right? So what do you want me to risk assess here? And there it's very interesting because most of them are actually silent and say nothing about which use case you are actually supposed to assess, except for the Europeans and the Koreans. And the Koreans are saying only test on intended use. So they very much, if you build a cookbook AI, test it on cookbooks. The Europeans say, test it also on reasonable misuse. Okay. We have Clerk out there. Clerk talks to you about the UI. Do I have to make sure it doesn't do nasty things? I don't know. Have to figure it out. These are the kind of issues that we are thinking about. So this is, I think, a first cut at this information. Happy to share more. It's said on next slide. Don't quote me yet. We are still building. Thanks a lot. I'll hand it over back.
Thank you, Johannes, for this impressive mapping of the rules that helps us understand where we are headed. And I can only recommend Clerk. It's an excellent tool, so try it out. We are running out of time, and we have an important last question as to how you see sort of the future of trade in AI or AI and trade. And I know Jason has to leave, so I'm gonna give him the floor for his final words, and we can continue the discussion then. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mira. And I've just been looking in parallel at both at Clerk and at the activity tracker that Johannes was talking about, and they're amazing tools. We did sort of start playing around here at SMU last year on sort of an EU AI Act draft comparison tool. And actually never got it across the line. So it's lovely to see that that it's there and it's functional, and I'm looking forward to playing with the beta. So yeah, just super quickly, what does trade and AI look like in the future? I mean, I'm a lawyer again. I don't like crystal ball gazing. I'm not sort of an empirical, prognosticator generally, but I think, definitely from our work, I think trade in AI and the shape of AI generally is going to be impacted by cross-border data regulation. I think that's really really essential. And the only point I think that I could value add to that beyond what others have said and no doubt will say is that, look, something I'm still struggling with. No legal sub-regime really adequately deals with sort of data governance. And that's at the domestic level, and I think we're seeing that's translating, obviously, through to the multilateral, plurilateral, and bilateral level as well, because we don't quite know, which kind of framework or paradigm to approach this from within. It's not property, it's not really intellectual property. That doesn't cover the field. Privacy and personal data protection doesn't cover the field. Contract by itself is not really adequate. How do we account for the national security and critical industry and industrial policy sort of interests and imperatives which are increasingly shaping the field? So I think that's going to be something, that's an open question, at least in my mind, that will bear on the shape of trade in AI over the next, let's say, 5 to 20 years. That is significant. I think, beyond this, obvious points again that have been made. There are increasingly AI modules in conventional software tech stacks, and I think that again problematizes the idea about asking about the future of trade in AI. Because AI is in everything. I think we'll see the dominance of platforms and first mover path dependencies. Johannes talked about some of the opportunities at the application layer and downstream, but we're going to have probably a handful of these large foundation models and other sort of cutting edge AI technologies, and they're going to cluster around certain jurisdictions and certain markets. And a lot of that's also going to reflect some of the path dependencies from the Web 2 era that we've had, and the massive windfall which is currently being exploited by those companies of user-generated data over the last couple of decades. We're seeing a lot of AI research and development moving from the public sphere, including the public sector, including universities, into, again, a fairly small number of private companies. What do universities do in the new landscape? But at the same time, we're seeing a lot of stimulatory and sort of stimulatory direct and other regulation to promote industrial policy. So on the one hand, it's moving into private houses. On the other hand, those private houses are benefiting from industrial policy because they're now, almost in a very 18th century way, sort of the champion of perceived national and geostrategic interests. I think, with the increasing regulation of AI, trade's going to be impacted. Is it going to be fragmentation? Are we going to see a Brussels effect globally? Are we going to see more regional crystallization? We've seen nascent moves, for example, here in ASEAN, but is ASEAN the kind of regional body which is going to ever give us something like the AI Act? Again, the reminder, and others have alerted to that today, AI is not just up there in the ether. It's, electrons traveling through fiber optic cables. It's data centers that run on electricity. We need water. So these are really evident in a place like Singapore, whose digital economy is sort of racing ahead, but it's severely constrained by things like water, space, electricity. And so actually regional integration, for example, in the Johor, Singapore, Riau Islands sort of area is absolutely crucial. And so cross-border trade in all of the physical sort of footprint of the AI value chain is also going to impinge on sort of trade in AI and any jurisdictions sort of digitalization and AI journey, and that includes even things like rare sands and so forth. So that they would be my prognostications in terms of what the future may look like. And I am very sorry, I'm going to have to be rude and jump off right now, but I've enjoyed this session so much, and thank you for your wonderful moderation, Mira.
Thank you, Jason, for all your remarks, and also for highlighting here the importance of having adequate governance frameworks for this trade in AI. I would like to ask you to be fairly brief, but still hear from Marilia and Colo about your vision of sort of trade in AI. Marilia, would you like to take?
Thank you. Thank you, Mira. I think that to be brief, there are two ways that we can look at it, more from a private sector perspective and more from a country geopolitical perspective. And I'll focus more on the second one. But for the private sector, I think that we have seen here examples of rather small organizations that are using AI to develop in-house AI applications, fine-tune it to the needs of the organization, of the communities that they're trying to serve. And this customization of AI, I think it will be a big thing in the future. Selling these customized AI solutions will be an important new frontier of the digital economy. We have seen this with OpenAI. They have created a GPT store where there are customized versions of ChatGPT developed by OpenAI or third parties. And I think that developments like the GPT store show that we are entering a new era of development of the platform economy as well. It remains to be seen whether we learn from the mistakes that we made in the first wave of the platform economy in terms of competition, gatekeeping, and if we're going to fix that with this new wave. But from a country or geopolitical perspective, I think that trade in AI is going to be very much complicated in the future by the fact that AI is being considered a critical and emerging technology, and countries have a clearly intensified competition to develop and to deploy this kind of technologies. If we look at the 2022 US National Strategy on critical and emerging technologies, or the list update, we see that AI appears as one of these technologies, and one that straddles and builds upon other technologies considered as critical, such as networking technologies and semiconductors. So any actions that governments take on AI itself or in one of these infrastructures will impact the trade in AI. And we are seeing this with multiple executive orders being approved in the US, not only on AI, but also securing ICTS supply chains, on sensitive data, which looks like an executive order focused on privacy, but I think it opens the door to treat data and data flows from this more national security perspective that I think we'll see more and more in the future. So countries are developing this very protective stance on critical emerging technologies, not only and following a very balance of power approach, investing not only in their own capabilities and trying to curb the capabilities of adversaries, putting in place sort of a mix of security oriented measures and trade measures, and building alliances. And friendshoring is entering very much into the picture here. And Johannes talked about the diversification of the AI value chain according to competitive advantages such as water, energy. And some developing countries do have a lot of these competitive advantages, but following this logic of balancing threats and making alliances, will they be able to benefit if friendshoring is put in place? This may harm their capacity to be able to be suppliers of these technologies and kind of sideline their competitive advantages. And just as a final word, I would like to come back to a point that Craig made in the very beginning, which I think is a very important one, which is the link between AI and sustainability, considered in this multiple dimension of environmental, economic, social sustainability, but especially environmental one, because the development of AI brings about pressure on environmental resources related to the mining of rare earth minerals, related to water, energy. And I think that perhaps this is a link that we should establish more. We can put in place measures to not completely forgo, but to mitigate the impact of AI in the environment, and this link between trade and environmental sustainability that we are exploring could become handy to try to nudge the market in terms of gravitating towards this more environmental friendly way of developing AI. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Maria. It's very interesting. I think it links quite well to this sort of discourse that we have, a more general one on data sovereignty and this new industrial policy of artificial intelligence that we see emerging. And Nicholas, I think he has a nice piece on the EU digital partnership agreements in this context with Japan and Singapore that are not trade related, but they do have this component on data digital sovereignty. So I give the floor now to Colo for her final remarks on the future of trade in AI. And I would like to ask you to be fairly brief. Thank you.
I will be actually very, very brief because I'm cognizant that we have no time. So I'm going to sort of wrap up what I wanted to say in about 30 seconds. But for me, the future of trade and AI lies in standards. I think I've already alluded to that. There are about 300 of them that are in development or have been adopted so far. It's a huge number. And I mean, we're not only looking at sort of, the ISO, IEC, IEEE, but also looking at sort of domestic standardization bodies. And I think this is really a great opportunity for the WTO to plug into this space. So far, there's only been 2 notifications of AI trade concerns in the TBT committee. Obviously, it seems like members are not making the connection between trade and AI as yet, but obviously, there are standards that are being developed. And so I think bringing back this conversation to the members and using the WTO platform, there's the Code of Good Practice. The TBT agreement has got, really good provisions on harmonization and standardization and non-discrimination, just the things that the WTO is known for. So I think this is where, for, lack of, anything else, but going forward, this is where the future of trade should be looking at, really, to avoid fragmentation.
Thanks, Colo. And that is why you're writing a PhD on AI and trade and standards. So that fits very, very well. We don't have any questions from the audience, or a few of those that were asked were already answered. We are running out of time, but I would like to give the floor to Greg and Johannes if they want to have a sort of a final word, so that we sort of complete the loop. Greg, do you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for their insights today. And whether we're looking at trade for AI, or AI for trade, sorry, or trade in AI, it's obviously a multifaceted issue, and it must be kind of framed and understood in all these different ways. So I'll just kind of close with that, but it was excellent to hear everyone's insights on this matter, and it kind of exceeded my expectations. I mean, we could have gone on probably for hours, but we're limited to this timeline. So just a thank you to the panel, to you, Mira, for acting as the moderator, and for everyone who attended today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Johannes.
I'll just second that as well. Thanks for having us here, or me personally. And as Craig said, I think this is not one webinar, but you should make it 7 or so. So just sign me up. Thank you, Trade Policy Exchange. Thank you, Mira. Thank you.
Yeah,
everybody.
thank you all for this incredibly rich discussion, and to the Trade Policy Exchange for organizing, for giving us this platform to debate. And I wish everyone a wonderful day, and thank you again. Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.